Thank you all for being at this next session. Our first speaker on this next session is Elisa Torres, who's an MA student in philosophy at the University of Dallas, where she plans to earn her PhD through the university's Institute of Philosophic Studies. Elisa received her BA in English and Theology from Belmont Abbey College in 2017, where she also minored in Christianity and Culture, Medieval Studies, and Political Philosophy. She was a member of the St. Thomas More Scholarship Program, and in her senior year was given the Outstanding St. Thomas More Scholar Award. And this past summer, Elisa Torres was received into the 10th cohort of the Lilly Graduate Fellows. So if you are a student here at Central and you're thinking about perhaps applying to the Lilly Fellows program, she will be a great person to talk to later. So the title of her talk today is The Ills of Man Writ Large, Humanism in Thomas More's Utopia. The Ills of Man Writ Large, Humanism in Thomas More's Utopia. In Thomas More's Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation, the prison-confined Anthony is visited by his nephew Vincent. Reminiscent of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, the two enter into a conversation regarding the means by which man might seek comfort amidst suffering. However, unlike the natural remedies that Lady Philosophy bestows upon Boethius, Anthony comforts his nephew with reminders of Christ crucified, redemptive suffering, and the Christian hope of a heavenly kingdom to come. Quote, "Anything that ever I read in the philosophers, I never could yet find that those natural remedies were able to give sufficient comfort of themselves. For they never stretch so far but that they leave untouched, for lack of necessary knowledge, that special point which is not only the chief comfort of all, but without which also all other comforts are nothing. And that point is to refer their final end and comfort to God, and to repute and take for the special cause of comfort that by the patient sufferance of their tribulation they shall attain his favor, and for their pain receive reward at his hand in heaven. And therefore, as I say, for lack of these things, the philosophers' natural, comfortable counsels are very far insufficient." End quote. The insufficiency of the philosopher's natural remedies is brought to the reader's attention throughout the entire dialogue of comfort, to such an extent that one might suppose there exists a great hostility between Thomas More and philosophy. Particularly, while observing the striking similarities between More's Dialogue of Comfort and Boethius's Consolation, one might reasonably question, why might Thomas More make a distinct effort to provide exclusively Christian remedies for the ills of man? The answer to this question lies to a great extent in More's magnum opus, the Utopia, or in the full glory of its original title, About the Best State of a Republic and the New Island of Utopia, a truly golden handbook, no less beneficial than entertaining, by Thomas More, a most distinguished and eloquent man, citizen and undersheriff of the famous city of London. Like his Dialogue of Comfort, More's Utopia is also written as a dialogue. The conversation is had between Peter Giles, Thomas More as a character, and Raphael Hythloday, Hythlos meaning nonsense, and Deos meaning skilled or cunning. And it is none other than he who is skilled in nonsense who provides an account of the mores and customs of the land of no place, Utopia, as its name etymologically indicates. While the Dialogue of Comfort examines the sufferings of man and its Christian remedies, the Utopia explores the ills of a regime and its natural remedies. Through the exposition of what Raphael Hythloday refers to as the best regime, More's Utopia presents a theory of man writ large. This theory of man, or anthropology, forms the basis of what I will be discussing at length in this presentation, humanism. By classifying Hythloday's theory of man as a humanism, I will examine as a composite whole what he believes to be both the ills of man as well as his proposed natural remedies. In doing so, I hope to accomplish the following three tasks. 1, to provide a sufficient definition of humanism for our purposes. 2, identify the humanism of Raphael Hythloday within Thomas More's Utopia. And lastly, to demonstrate the incompatibility of Hythlodae's humanism with Thomas More's own Christian humanism, as seen in his Dialogue of Comfort Against Tribulation. To begin with the first task of this presentation, a definitional attempt at humanism. In a 1943 lecture given at Marquette University entitled Humanism and Theology, the Harvard University professor Werner Jaeger explores the concept of humanism in both its ancient and modern forms. From Cicero's Humanitas to the Greco-Roman culture of the Renaissance, Jaeger identifies the foundational premise upon which every form of humanism is founded upon. Quote, "The point of departure for every humanism must be its concept of human nature." End quote. The term humanism originally emerged in the 19th century as a category for the Renaissance humanists. While the Renaissance scholars did not refer to themselves as humanists, they received this coinage because of their emphasis on Greco-Roman culture, particularly with their adaptation of Cicero's educational system. Cicero is often referred to as the father of humanism, with his introduction of the Humanitas, which is the Latin correspondence to the Greek paideia. Cicero understands by it the arts and letters of the Greeks insofar as they present the Greek ideal of man. Yet even in antiquity, there existed a tension between what Jaeger coins as a theocentric humanism versus an anthropocentric humanism. The latter emerged from the ancient Greek sophists, especially Protagoras, who taught that man is the measurement of all things. The anthropocentrism of the sophists thwarted their ability to transcend the natural. Their purely natural ideal will emerge again in the humanism of modernity. The theocentric humanism Jaeger refers to is that same humanism which was adopted by the Christian medievalists. It is based not on the Greek sophists, but on their primary opponent, Socrates. As Jaeger reminds us, it is, quote, "In Plato's laws where we read a word that throws a bar of light back to the beginning of Socrates' strenuous path and over Plato's entire work. God is the measurement of all things." Or as we read in Plato's Theaetetus, "True human virtue is assimilation to God," end quote. This divine ideal informed Socrates' understanding of man. Accordingly, because man is not the measure of all things, the ills of mankind cannot be remedied by mere temporal means, but necessitate man's participation in the eternal. The divine ideal as seen in Socrates' understanding of man runs throughout the medieval period. Particularly within Christianity, as Aidan Nichols notes in his work, The Shape of Catholic Theology, the aspiration of such theologians as Abelard, Bernard, Hugh of St. Victor is, quote, "the restoration of human nature in its integrity. Their aim is spiritual and salvific," end quote. We begin to see a cultural shift in man's understanding of his own nature during the Renaissance. The humanism that marks this period, while Christian in many ways, turns its focus from man's ascending participation in the eternal to Christ's miraculous descent. Unlike much medieval iconic art, the glory of the Incarnation as seen in works as Bernini's Ecstasy of Teresa of Avila, Michelangelo's Pietà, and Raphael's Disputation of the Eucharist emphasize an imminent manifestation of God to man. Human nature, as understood during the Renaissance, can be broadly defined as a divinely immanent anthropology, man's greatness emphasized through the glory of the Incarnation. In regard to Hellenism, as Aidan Nichols observes, quote, "While the humanist movement fostered a new interest in the reconstruction of ancient texts and the mentality of those who had produced them, ultimately there was little philosophic development. What was new was not the knowledge of the ancients, but the kind of use made of it," end quote. Nichols. The Christian medievalist made use of Greco-Roman culture as a means to further his theology, whereas the Renaissance man, quote, "instead of seeing classical antiquity as before, a treasury to be exploited, a treasury of wisdom, knowledge, and artistic and literary procedures on which one might draw indefinitely, took the view that ancient works should be regarded as models to be imitated," end quote. Natural pagan virtue resurfaces as a model rather than an aid toward man's Christian end. Consequently, we begin to see the humanism of the Renaissance shift back towards Protagoras' axiom, man is the measure of all things. As Werner Jaeger argues, it is a theory of human nature that serves as a point of departure for every form of humanism. At this point, it may serve as a beneficial consideration to recall Aristophanes' speech on Eros in Plato's Symposium. The comic poet begins his eulogy with, quote, "a delineation of human nature and its afflictions," end quote. He then proceeds to provide an account of what precisely it is that the god Eros accomplishes for mankind. Eros rejoins lover and beloved to their primordial harmony. To begin with the ills of man, as Aristophanes does, is to simultaneously suggest some ideal. And as soon as one admits of an ideal, he has a conception of human nature. The restoration of man to this ideal is what seems to be classically understood as humanism. In turning to Thomas More's Utopia, it will be Raphael Hythlodae's understanding of human nature that reveals the form of his humanism. His theory is not discursive but literary and will require a close reading of the text itself. A few questions to consider here. In outlining the mores and customs of the utopian best regime, what kind of understanding of man is Hythlodae presenting for his interlocutors? What are the ills that inflict mankind, and what are the means by which these ills can be remedied? To begin, while Hythlodae does not detail the mores of the utopians until the second half of the book, we begin to see intimations in the first half of what he believes to be the ills of man. Being deeply impressed by Hythlodae's knowledge and experience in travels, Thomas More tries to convince him to enter political life. Hythlodae responds in the negative, explaining that he had already attempted and failed to make kings philosophers. Hythlodae then recounts a former conversation he had with a certain layman skilled in English law, and Father John Morton, Archbishop of Canterbury, Cardinal, and then also Chancellor of England. The conversation primarily surrounds what ought to be the official manner in dealing with theft. This layman, quote, began to praise in detail the strict justice that was being enforced at the time on thieves in England, who, he related, were being executed all over the place, sometimes 20 hanging on one gallows. And he said that he wondered all the more at what evil fate made it happen that when so few escaped the penalty, so many were still everywhere busy at thievery. End quote. The question which introduces Hythlodae's solution to the problem of theft is consequently an anthropological question. Why do men commit evil even when they know certain punishment will follow? At a first glance, Hythlodae's solution may seem philosophically benign. Quote, severe and fearful punishments are decreed for thieving when in fact what should much rather be provided is some means for making a living, so there would be no dire necessity first to steal, and second to die for stealing, end quote. Give men a means by which to make a living, and they will no longer steal. However, as Hythlodae continues to delineate his solution to theft, we begin to see intimations of an anthropocentric theory of human nature. That is, a theory of human nature which regards man as the measure of all things. Raphael goes on to explain to the cardinal and layman that the true causes of theft in England are not what might immediately appear to be. After giving a detailed argument as to why the multitude of military occupations prevents men from being truly learned in the good arts of making a living, Hythlodae follows this line of reasoning by drawing attention to, quote, a far greater reason that alone necessitates thievery. What might this ultimate reason of English theft be? This malicious and vile cause that alone forces a man to take that which does not belong to him? Not the depravity of human nature, not the inherited guilt of the fall, but rather ravenous and untamed sheep. These sheep, who are, quote, so mild and meagerly fed, become so ravenous and untamed that they devour the very people and lay waste and rage their fields, homes, and towns. And those holy abbots leave no land for plowing, close off everything for pasture, demolish homes, destroy towns, and spare the churches, but only for the purpose of stabling sheep, end quote. If only these abbots would spend less time converting pagans and more time converting their sheep grazing fields into the land for crops, which would then provide prospective thieves enough labor to earn a living, if only such a thing would transpire, we would root out the cause of theft in England forever. Now, if these measures are not taken and theft continue to ensue, Hythlodae recommends the penal methods of the Persian poliorites, from the Greek meaning people of much nonsense. When theft is committed, the offenders are, quote, sentenced to hard labor, and unless they have committed some more serious crime than theft, they are neither shut in prison nor clamped in shackles, but are employed, free and unfettered, in public works. Those who avoid working or work too sluggishly are not bound in chains, but urged on by whips. In these matters, this is their law, and this is their procedure, as I have said. How humane and beneficial it is, for it serves to remove vice while preserving human beings who are treated in such a way that they have to be good," end quote. Such penal methods do not merely deal with the problem of theft on the official level, but as Hythloday claims, treat thieves in such a way that they have to be good, and thereby serve to remove vice. By proposing that all vice is eradicated when thieves are forced to labor without pay, Hythloday suggests that the ills of man are external to man. They are not caused by some interior motive. The Polya rights treatment of thieves is brought to a societal level in the land of Utopia. Yet unlike the Polya rights, whose enslavement comes as a form of punishment, the Utopians live in a perpetual state of unpaid labor and communal ownership. Quote, "For wherever there is private property, wherever everybody measures everything with money, there it can hardly ever happen that a republic will be governed justly or prosperously," end quote. The Utopians have no ambition to enlarge their territory, quote, "since they consider themselves the cultivators rather than the owners of their lands," end quote. Such commonality additionally manifests itself in familial relations. Quote, "Care is taken that no household has fewer than 10 or more than 16 adults, and since the number of children cannot be pre-established, this limit is easily maintained by transferring into the smaller households those who have grown up in the fuller ones. But if the population of a single city ever becomes more numerous than it should, they repair the underpopulation of other cities," end quote. This rejection of one's own is seen throughout the Utopians' mores. Their clothing is homogeneous. Their meals are shared in common, and not least of all, their chickens are deprived of their right to hatch their own eggs. Quote, "For it is not the hens, but the Utopians themselves who incubate the eggs. As soon as the chicks come from the egg, they follow and recognize the humans instead of their mothers," end quote. Hythloday's description of the utopian mores moves from the sharing of all property to the sharing of children until finally this socialistic chain of being ascends to the sharing of religion. While the utopians are permitted to practice some form of religion in private, there is a communal utopian religion that cannot conflict with the private. The communal emphasis consequently remains predominant. Even in times of sickness, rather than being treated by loved ones, utopians are sent to the public hospitals. Thus, quote, "the whole island is like a single family," end quote. As Hythloday suggested in dealing with the theft in England, the political institutions of the utopians serve a moral end, the eradication of vice. Quote, "Through that kind of law, I would say, these evils also might be lessened and mitigated, the way terminally ill bodies are sustained by that repeated application of lotions. But that they be really healed and restored to good condition, there is no hope at all as long as people possess their own property," end quote. By sharing all things in common, the utopians have no cause for jealousy, pride, or envy. There's no war among them because there is no land to conquer. Peace and pleasure are the bearers of happiness. They represent the ideal state of man. Quote, "For how can you be wealthier than to live free of absolutely all anxiety, with a happy and tranquil mind? No one is fearful for his life or vexed by the demands of his wife, in fear of poverty for his son, or anxious about the dowry of his daughter, but instead each feels secure about the life and happiness both of himself and his family. For in Utopia, along with the use of money, all greed for money has been entirely removed from there. What a mass of troubles was cut back. What a crop of crimes was torn out by the roots. For who does not know that fraud, theft, fights, mob violence, brawls, rebellion, murder, treachery, poisonings would all die away once money is done away with? And not only that, but at the very moment money disappears, so would fear, anxiety, worries, toils, and sleeplessness likewise. Even poverty itself, which is apparently merely the lack of money, would immediately decrease once money were completely removed," end quote. Hythloday's final commentary on the common life of the utopians presents the full disclosure of his humanism. He admits, like Aristophanes in Plato's Symposium, that mankind has ailments, fear, anxiety, greed, violence, rebellion, and so forth. He additionally recognizes that unless these ailments are torn out by the roots, they will continue to plague mankind, since daily punishments are insufficient in rooting out the cause. The only solution able to fully remedy man from his sickness is the obliteration of money, which fully manifests itself in the obliteration of all that is naturally one's own, as seen in the sharing of children and the public hospital system. The solution to these ailments marks Hyphloday's understanding of human nature. Man suffers from an illness. This illness is economically contrived. The solution to this illness lies in the economic equality of conditions. Such equality can be organized by man, and once it is, man is led to his fulfillment, non-violent conformity to the legal system. At this point, it is evident that Hyphloday's understanding of human nature, its ills, and its remedies will cause deep concerns for a man such as Thomas More. Toward the end of Hyphloday's account, the character of More provides intimations of such concerns. While the Utopia ends with More's character confessing, quote, that there are very many things in the Republic of the Utopians that I would rather wish for in our politics, end quote, he prefaces such a statement by commenting on the dispositions of the Utopians as a whole. Quote, by this one institution, their common life and economy, all nobility, magnificence, splendor, and majesty are profoundly eliminated, end quote. The comment foreshadows a similar sentiment that Alexis de Tocqueville had in observing the equality of conditions in America. While, quote, gross depravity would be less common, extraordinary virtues would without doubt be rarer, end quote. Man's ideal is lowered, and consequently he no longer needs divine aid to heal him of his infirmities. Hyphloday himself suggests such flatness of soul in referencing the Roman general Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Roman history. Quote, wealth and liberty are incapable of putting up patiently with harsh and unjust commands, whereas poverty and scarcity, in contrast, blunt people's spirits, makes them patient, and removes from the souls of the oppressed that aristocratic spirit of rebellion, end quote. Man is simultaneously thwarted in his rebellion as he is thwarted in his magnanimity. More's critique in the Utopia is subtle in comparison to the doctrinal clarity of Anthony in his dialogue of comfort against tribulation. The only intimations of disapproval we receive in the Utopia regard the lowliness of man's ideal. Consequently, it is predominantly by means of satire and irony that the Utopia provides a Socratic negative knowledge of human nature and its ailments. However, such negative knowledge is not of little substance. The Utopia emerges as a pristine portrait of anthropocentric humanism, with its flattened ideals and insufficient remedies to the ills of man. In turning to a dialogue of comfort against tribulation, Anthony's caution against purely rational remedies now seems greatly warranted when considering the humanistic alternative to a Christian anthropology. For lack of necessary knowledge, reason alone simply cannot provide the medicine needed to heal man of his suffering, nor can it produce a regime on earth of any lasting worth. While the ills of man, as Christianity maintains and as Anthony reiterates, are, quote, the relics that remain in mankind of our old original sin, end quote, man's nature is not wholly incapacitated. As indicated by Thomas More's synthesis of faith and reason, there is hope for a truly Christian humanism, one which presents a theory of man as revealed by Christ, with Christ as the ultimate remedy to man's deepest ills. If one's humanism is not founded upon a theory of man whose ideals lie in the divine, it is sure to become utopian. Henri de Lubac, in his work, The Drama of Atheist Humanism, argues something quite similar. Quote, it is not true, as is sometimes said, that man cannot organize the world without God. What is true is that without God, he can ultimately only organize it against man. Exclusive humanism is inhumane humanism, end quote. The inhumanity of the utopians becomes evident as Hyphlodey delineates their mores. And if this satirical work is not clear enough, Thomas More provides his dialogue of comfort. In the dialogue of comfort, More condemns the purely rational anthropocentric humanism that would seek to reduce the ills of man to a product of his society. As you recall in my opening statements, Anthony advises his nephew to seek spiritual comfort above natural comfort, so as to direct oneself to God. However, as likened to the last words of the Utopia, Anthony additionally advises Vincent to avoid the opposite extreme. Quote, "We shall therefore neither fully receive these philosophers' reasons in this matter, nor yet utterly refuse them. But using them in such order as may beseem them, we shall fetch the principal and effectual medicines against these diseases of tribulation from that great, high, and excellent physician, without whom we could never be healed of our very deadly disease." End quote. Anthony's words here demonstrate the greatness of Thomas More's moderation in regard to both nature and grace and faith and reason. The Utopia satirizes the limits of a purely philosophical anthropology, unaided by revelation. Yet, as made clear in the Dialogue of Comfort, More does not consequently embrace an over-spiritualized fideism that would seek to abandon all natural means of obtaining wisdom. Even while recognizing the impossibility of a perfect earthly regime, More continued to serve his polis. He maintained throughout his life and his writings a certain optimistic realism regarding human nature and its limitations, a realism that can perhaps best be summed up in his character's words to Hythloday. Quote, "If you cannot make something good, at least make it the least bad you can. For it is truly impossible for everything to turn out well, unless all human beings are good. And I don't expect that to happen for some years to come." End quote. Thank you for your time.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions and discussion. So, thoughts, questions for Elisa Torres?
Just a question to try to get clarification. So, as I understand your reading of the Utopia is that this is an ironic critique of what you call anthropocentric humanism, and the dialogue is not as ironic. It seemed that what an interpret Anthony is not speaking ironic. Why should we not interpret Anthony as speaking ironically as well? You seem to take him at not exactly face value.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that's a good question. I think my immediate reason for that is the character of Thomas More within the Utopia criticizes Hythloday. And so you already listen to Raphael Hythloday's delineation of the best regime with a kind of skepticism, because the characters themselves pose very good questions, and Thomas More concludes by saying, well, we can take what's good, but there are a lot of red flags here. In terms of Anthony and Vincent, I suppose it's possible to read it satirically. My argument would be, I suppose, biographical, in that Thomas More is writing this in prison. Anthony is in prison. His letters to Catherine follow a very similar line of argumentation as Anthony's words to his nephew, Vincent. So Vincent comes to him, and he is the one who needs comfort, even though Vincent is not in prison. And Anthony seeks to comfort him. And there are some passages that almost identically overlap with Thomas More's words to his daughter Catherine when she visits him in prison. And so if that biographical overlap can be justified, I would say that that's my main reason for not seeing that as primarily a satirical work.
So when you describe Utopia as ironic or satirical, I also pick up that you're saying that it could be seen as a kind of thought experiment. Let's see what we find out if we make a certain set of assumptions, and what comes out of that. Not necessarily that everything that comes out of that is going to be of no use, right? Because there are some things that are maybe usable within that, but there's something about the overall framework in which the ideas are being developed that more rejects the framework, but not necessarily everything that arises within it.
Yeah, and I think that's probably true. At one point, Hythloday says, let's see what would happen if, actually, I think it might be more in the introduction, says, let's see what will happen if we put Plato's theory that he sets forth in the Republic in a more concrete form. There's explicit references to Plato's Republic in the dialogue, in the Utopia, and so in that sense, it is a kind of thought experiment. And I wouldn't say that Thomas More rejects everything, because especially with his comments within the text itself, but also seeing his relationship with his friend Erasmus, who is a humanist, you can see throughout his life that he was a Renaissance man, that he loved the arts. Even his engagement in political life demonstrates that this is not something he's satirizing without any concern to its worth, if that makes sense. So yeah, I mean, and these issues were relevant. The fact that Hythloday's first name is Raphael, I don't think is of little importance either. Raphael's Stanza della Segnatura would have just been finished a couple of years before the publication of the Utopia, and that room really synthesizes faith and reason in an unprecedented way. You have the Disputation of the Eucharist on one panel, facing the School of Athens on the other side, with Mount Parnassus, and then the cardinal virtues and theological virtues on the other wall. And so you have this kind of dialogue of philosophy and faith and reason and the arts that clearly Thomas More does not, he's using Raphael as a character to satirize, perhaps maybe as a kind of archetype of Renaissance humanism, but certainly not as a means to dismiss.
I just want to make a comment. It's very encouraging somebody as young as you reading the book. And also, just wanted to comment that I think it's fascinating that the word utopia we get from this text, which is an ironic text, because there's really no fiction that can ever take place in utopia because nothing would happen. So there have been a couple of efforts at utopian novels that have been completely horrible. Right. A couple of 19th century American examples I can think of. I just think that's so interesting.
Yeah, it really is, and it's funny because sometimes, some of these novels, Brave New World is described as a dystopic novel, when really the original use of utopia is dystopic in the way it's being used now, So there was never a perfect regime, so, yeah.
Sure, I'm not the first person to notice the similarities between Gulliver and the Land of the Houyhnhnms and the features of the utopian society, and that's definitely a satire.
Oh yeah, Gulliver uses similar method to outline his travels, and yeah, with the Houyhnhnms, they're even in that story too. There's a serious critique of pure reason. I mean, the Houyhnhnms just presenting this very cold, shared life between one another. They also share their children and their wives, and humans in their passion are regarded as just garbage. And Swift himself, or at least the character, comes to regard all passion in man as repulsive, and the Houyhnhnms present this very, very similar utopic regime of shared things and the rejection of what is one's own by nature. So yeah, I think that's definitely worth pointing out.
And yet, as you recalled it, the account of thievery in England begins with a critique of the church, right? The greedy abbots, whose farming practices, put sheep everywhere. I mean, what's going on there?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So that was theft in England that Hythloday was critiquing, but even in the Utopia, when he mentions religion, because the Utopians are religious to a certain extent, but it's a pragmatic religion, and so long as it doesn't interfere with the peace and stability of common life, then it's fine. And at one point, there's a description of an overzealous man that tries to convert a fellow utopian to his tribe, and he's cast from the city. And so you can't have any kind of tension. And so even in that passage there where he begins by critiquing the abbots, right, who have their pastures for sheep, not for crops, the suggestion there is that religion's getting in the way of pragmatism. And so that should be primary. And so it's a lot of these things are very subtle.
I guess I'm just going to try to help you a little on that. It seemed to me that the point is that the church, particularly in the form of monasticism, is trying to do something that Plato's trying to do in Book 5 of the Republic, namely wipe out family and private property in the name of a utopia that doesn't exist anywhere. And so I guess I would read that as a very real criticism of at least a group of Christians in the time period. So it's in other words, I guess I would defer to you, but isn't the suggestion that not only is he being ironic toward what would you call anthropocentric humanism, but here's something about Christianity that he's that he's satirizing.
Well,
excuse me, I was just going to add to that.
Okay.
Wondering what the connection was to the fact that the abbots were about to get their comeuppance.
I'm sorry?
The dissolution of the monastery. Right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It might be a satire of the monasteries as well. I think it's interesting, though, that Raphael upholds and praises the mores of the utopians and their shared life, but does not mention that when he talks about the monasteries. And so the critique in that particular passage is that the monasteries aren't making good use of their land, and they're not giving lay people enough jobs. And I'd have to do another close reading to see every time monasteries comes up, maybe there is something being paralleled there. Hythloday seems critical. And so if Hythloday is critical, and Thomas More is critical of Hythloday, I wonder if Thomas More wouldn't have too negative of a view toward the monastery. Especially he himself wanted to enter the monastery. He didn't know enough Latin at the time, and so he was rejected. And his wife had a similar situation too with joining a convent. And so I think Thomas More understood the contemplative life of monasticism probably better than Hythloday. But it's not a closed question, and I'd like to go back because there might be something to that.
Anyone last question? Okay, thank you so much.